All right, so it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Don Mosier, and a lot of you in the audience will know him because he may well be your city councilman, correct? Here in how many of you live in Del Mar? So you probably know him. However, what you may not know about him is that he is an MD, PhD. He is at the Scripps Research Institute working on AIDS research, and he's been working on AIDS research since it was first discovered in 1981. And he is going to talk to us about how we could end this ghastly epidemic. So please welcome Dr. Don Mosier.
Well, thank you. It's late in the evening, and so I wanted to address a set of issues that should wake you up. So I'm going to talk about sex, a sexually transmitted disease that without treatment leads to death, and whose solution will depend upon political will and will cost money. So I'm going to talk about the third rail of politics. I've had 3 careers, first as a physician, second as a scientist, and now as a politician, and my credibility keeps going down, down, down. Okay, but bear with me. Okay. Let me just quickly review the history of the recognized AIDS epidemic. In 1981, the first AIDS cases were identified in Los Angeles. It was likely that the virus that causes AIDS, a retrovirus, was transmitted from chimpanzees to humans in the early part of the last century. In 1984, this virus, HIV-1, was identified as the cause of AIDS. And that was a very important advance because it allowed blood testing to protect the blood supply, and it changed HIV from a disease that was transmitted accidentally to what it is today, which is almost totally a sexually transmitted disease. In 1987, the first antiretroviral drug was approved. It was AZT. It had been used previously as an anti-cancer agent. It had some toxicity. It was brought back out, and it was very effective for the first 6 months of treatment. Unfortunately, HIV is an RNA virus. It mutates incredibly rapidly, 10,000 times faster than the human genome. And AZT only worked for 6 months because the virus developed resistance to that drug. In 1996, we first began to make an impact on treating HIV infection because combinations of drugs were available at that time that attacked different parts of the AIDS virus. And if the virus developed resistance to one drug, it was much more difficult to develop resistance to 2 or 3 drugs. In 2007, we had 2 new classes of anti-HIV agents, so we've got a bigger armamentarium to treat disease. And currently we have 24 individual anti-HIV drugs to treat an infection, and many combinations of those would add up to about 35 drugs, including the combinations in the armamentarium. So where are we in the global epidemic? Well, we're not making progress very fast. Whoops. These slides have all changed color. That's weird. But anyway, there are currently 33 million people living with HIV. That's a growing number, slowly growing. There are about 3 million people infected each year, and about 2 million deaths per year. So we've had all these effective AIDS drugs developed, and yet the epidemic continues, and it's continued almost unabated. There's several reasons for this, and I want to go through these reasons because to understand why we're failing this effort is part of the process to understand what we need to do in the future to do better. The big problem has been that these drug treatments are very expensive, and we've allocated all the drugs to treating established infection, and until this year, virtually none of them to preventing infection. The sole exception to this is the use of drugs to prevent mother-to-infant transmission, which has been very effective in the developed world and not so effective in the developing world. The big problem has been in preventing a sexually transmitted disease that U.S. policymakers and even the WHO has not been very effective in dealing with trying to prevent a sexually transmitted disease. The U.S. is the most prudish nation in the world in talking, frankly, about sex and sexually transmitted diseases, and this has been a big impediment to effectively dealing with the worldwide AIDS epidemic. The defining U.S. policy positions that have guided our attempts to control HIV worldwide have been just say no and ABC. ABC is abstinence, be faithful, and condoms. And this projects the arrogance of the U.S. understanding of global health to situations we know very little about. This is a picture of Jacob Zuma, one of the most revered figures in South Africa, the president of South Africa. He just won an award for the most effective president in the African continent. Jacob Zuma has 24 acknowledged children, 5 wives, 3 current mistresses, and probably some other unacknowledged children. And he is a model for the African male. It's very important to understand that the only way we're going to control HIV transmission in Africa and other parts of the developed world is to empower women, and we have to understand the sexual politics that take place in different cultures, something we have done a terrible job of doing to date. Now, I want to go through some examples of sort of miscommunication and missteps and spread the blame broadly, because that's part of the problem that we need to understand. First, scientists are part of the problem and have been a significant part of the problem. Scientists like me are trained to be very skeptical of new data, but extreme skepticism demands unreasonable proof. 2 California scientists, one based right here in La Jolla, Peter Duisberg and Carrie Mullins, have for the last 10 years been part of the AIDS denialist movement. They think that HIV-1 does not cause AIDS despite incontrovertible evidence that it does. That position was seized upon by the prior government in South Africa and delayed the rollout of antiretroviral treatment by 10 years at a cost of 2 million lives. Okay? It's fine to question scientific data, but when you cost 2 million lives, that is unacceptable. Bill Gates is part of the problem. I'm using PowerPoint. I don't like PowerPoint. But Bill Gates has been part of the problem in rolling out sexual transmission prevention strategies, because when he started the Gates Foundation, he assigned the task of recruiting scientists to his father, Bill Gates Sr. Bill Gates Sr. went to a Seattle organization called PATH that had worked in the contraceptive field, and all the PATH people were hired by the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation has been a major funder of trying to prevent HIV transmission using what are called microbicides, agents that might kill HIV during the transmission event. But all these people were trained in contraceptive devices, gels, rings, and 6 microbicide trials and many millions of dollars and 10,000 patients later, we still don't have an effective prevention strategy, and the prevention has focused almost entirely on contraceptive products. Okay? There are many ways to prevent HIV, but this has proven not to be one of them. The third problem I want to point out is that the Global Fund for AIDS did receive funding from a number of governments to start delivering antiretroviral treatment to developing countries. This is an article from New York Times, from just last month. And the problem has been with the global recession that this effort has suddenly stopped. And so a number of people in developing countries were started on antiretroviral drugs. They were working. Some of them were locally produced. They were very cheap. But suddenly that supply and the funding for that program has dried up. So there have been a number of unfortunate consequences of this failure to keep funding the Global Fund, and that is that many countries, including the United States, are failing to honor their pledge for the global campaign. So this program rolled out antiretrovirals, and now suddenly it's stopping. The current year pledge would be $27 billion, and only about $8 billion of that is going to be available for antiretrovirals. The consequence of this is twofold, and it's very important. One is that people are stopping their drugs in mid-therapy, or just taking drugs every few days, which encourages the development of antiretroviral resistance. So the HIV circulating is now getting more dangerous because it's resistant to many of the frontline drugs we have currently available. The other problem is because of the shortage of pills and the fact that many people anticipated therapy. There is now a black market developing for antiretrovirals, and so people are selling their pills rather than taking them so they can feed their families. The final problem, of course, is with this intermittent drug use, we're really increasing HIV resistance to these drugs dramatically. And just to put things in perspective, the current surge in Afghanistan would pay for the whole global program for antiretrovirals and HIV prevention. And this global program, the $27 billion, is from all the countries in the world, not the U.S. contribution. So I want to summarize where we are and what we need to do to make things better. The future, I think, is quite bleak unless we take action quickly. First of all, there's no AIDS vaccine in sight. So to count on an AIDS vaccine showing up in the next few years is unfortunately not realistic. We know that the drugs that are so effective in treating HIV infection are actually very good at preventing HIV infection. We know that from mother-to-infant child transmission studies. And we also know when you talk to people on the ground, the young women in Africa who are most at risk for acquiring infection, that they would much prefer to take a pill a day than to use a condom, have their partner use a condom, to use a ring, to use a gel to prevent HIV transmission. So if we listen to the people who actually are at highest risk for infection, they're saying that none of the microbicide prevention strategies are really acceptable to them. So if we can get antiretrovirals to them, that would be effective prevention. There used to be a cost issue, but local production of antiretrovirals now makes a pill cheaper than any of the rings, gels, or other prevention devices that the contraceptive field has tried to shift into this area. I've already said that the shortage of drugs has made resistance a problem, and you may not remember this, but we now have drug-resistant malaria all over the world because there was a black market in an effective drug called amantadine about 10 years ago. The same thing may happen with HIV infection if we continue this sort of halfway measure of giving some people antiretrovirals for a short time but not effectively treating the disease. The worst scenario is that there'll be a widespread distribution of drug-resistant HIV so that most of the current therapies won't work. Now, that's already happening in some places where there's a high HIV-1 incidence. And that makes a new global epidemic of drug-resistant HIV a possibility. That will make treatment more expensive for every infected individual in the world. So, where do I want to end? I want to end by echoing some of the comments of David Ellerman in the World Bank. We need to stop taking the arrogant position that the U.S. knows best how to treat diseases that are sexually transmitted in cultures that are vastly different from us. We need to empower local communities who know how HIV is transmitted in their community with preventive measures. We need to enable local production of drugs so they're readily available and very inexpensive. And we can do all this for much less than we're spending now to be ineffective. Thank you.